The child would not stop crying. Isolde pressed her daughter tighter against her chest, willing the sound down, willing herself smaller against the stone pillar where they had chained her wrist with a length of copper that had already begun to burn. The hall smelled of tallow and old wine and something beneath both, something mineral and final, like the inside of a tomb that had been opened once and never properly sealed again. She had not known, when Lord Fenwick had handed her the debt papers 3 weeks ago, that this was what settlement looked like. She had imagined labor. A farm, perhaps, some indentured arrangement she could survive and outlast. She was good at outlasting things. She had outlasted her mother's death at 14, her father's at 17, a marriage at 19, to a man who took everything she had and then died of fever before she could resent him properly. She had outlasted the pregnancy alone, the birth alone, 6 months of nursing alone in a 2-room cottage that belonged to Fenwick's estate. She had not outlasted this. The Hall of Hollow Vein was ancient, older than the village that crouched outside its walls, older than the road that had once been a Roman track. Its ceilings disappeared into shadow and its walls bore tapestries so faded their figures had become suggestions, horsemen perhaps, or angels with their wings folded down in grief. Candles burned in iron brackets, and beneath the dais at the far end of the hall, perhaps 30 men stood in clusters, some with wine, some without, all watching the platform with the particular stillness of men waiting to spend money they had not earned. Isolde was the 3rd offering of the evening. The first had been a boy, perhaps 12, with a talent for figures, sold to a merchant concern from the eastern provinces. The second had been a woman of middle years, a healer, sold so quickly and quietly that Isolde had barely registered it before the woman was gone. A velvet hood placed over her head with professional gentleness. Then came Fenwick's man, climbing the steps to the platform with the bored efficiency of a livestock handler. One Isolde Vale. He read from his paper, not looking at her. Age 22, sound health, literate, nursing mother, child included in transfer of debt obligation. The child Clara, 4 months old and furious with the world, wailed. Laughter from the floor, not cruel laughter, which might have been easier to bear. Amused laughter, the kind that meant she was not quite real to them. Isolde kept her eyes level. She had learned this from her father. That dignity was not a feeling but a posture. And posture could be maintained even when feeling had entirely collapsed. The bidding began. It was brisk. 3 men raised paddles in the first 30 seconds. She did not look at their faces. She looked instead at the far wall, at a tapestry figure that might have been a woman kneeling or a woman rising. It was impossible to tell from this distance which direction the figure was moving. She was rising, Isolde decided. She would decide that. The bidding slowed at 40 crowns, paused at 45. She heard Fenwick's man begin to speak the closing phrase. The doors opened, not loudly. That was the strangest thing. The doors of Hollow Vein's great hall were iron-banded oak, heavy enough that 2 men were required to move them, and yet they swung inward without sound, without visible effort, as though they had simply decided to open of their own accord. The man who entered was tall. That was the first thing, the sheer vertical fact of him, in a black coat that fell to his boots, his hair dark and overlong, his face arranged in an expression that was not quite blankness and not quite contempt, but something that lived precisely between them. He walked without haste. He walked the way old things moved, with the certainty of something that had never once needed to hurry, because the world had always, eventually, arranged itself to wait. The bidders parted. Isolde watched this happen and did not understand it immediately. The way men who had been standing loose and confident suddenly found reasons to step aside, to look elsewhere, to develop an urgent interest in their wine. Only afterward did she recognize it for what it was. Not politeness, not deference, fear. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at her. His eyes were dark, not merely brown or black, but dark in the way deep water was dark, in the way that suggested depth as a concept rather than a color. He looked at her face first, which she had not expected. Not her body, not the child. Her face. Then he looked at Clara. Something moved in his expression. It was brief and quickly controlled, a shadow crossing a still surface, but Isolde saw it. She was watching very carefully because she had learned, in 22 years of being overlooked and underestimated, that the moments other people did not realize they were being observed were the only moments they told the truth. Whatever he felt when he looked at Clara, it was not the amusement the others had shown. "What is the debt?" he asked. His voice was low and even, and filled the hall the way that thunder filled a valley, not by volume, but by resonance, as though the stones themselves vibrated slightly in response. Fenwick's man told him the figure. He reached into his coat. He produced a document, not coin, not a bank draft, but a document, and held it toward the man without looking away from Isolde. "That clears the full obligation," he said, "and all future claims." Fenwick's man sputtered. "Sir, the bidding is concluded." One word. The room accepted it without argument. The copper cuff fell from Isolde's wrist as though it had never been fastened. She did not see him touch it. She did not see him move. She only felt the absence of the metal and the return of circulation to her hand, and she stood on the platform in the candlelight with her daughter against her chest and looked down at the man who had just bought them both. He did not smile. "You are cold," he said, as though this were the most relevant fact in the room. "There is a carriage outside." He turned and walked back toward the open doors. After a moment, because there was nothing else in the world to do, Isolde followed. The carriage was black lacquered wood and pulled by horses that made no sound on the cobblestones, which should have been impossible, and which Isolde noted with the calm, dissociated clarity of someone who had already exceeded their capacity for ordinary shock. She sat across from him. Clara had impossibly fallen asleep within moments of entering the enclosed space, as though some quality of the air inside had gentled her. Isolde kept her arms around the child and said nothing. She was working very hard on saying nothing. She had learned that silence, deployed correctly, was its own form of gathering information, that people who were not being questioned would eventually speak, and what they chose to say without prompting was always more honest than anything extracted by direct inquiry. He sat with absolute stillness, not the stillness of a man restraining himself from movement, which always had a quality of tension to it, a suppressed energy that eventually leaked through in small ways. The tapping of a finger, the shift of a jaw, this was a different quality entirely. He was still the way stone was still, the way things were still that had no particular investment in the passage of time. It unnerved her. She allowed herself to feel unnerved privately, in the small interior space where she kept things she could not afford to show, and kept her face neutral. "I have not thanked you," she said finally, "because silence as a strategy had limits when you were indebted to a stranger in a sealed carriage moving through a moonless countryside. I am grateful. I wish to understand the terms." He looked at her. He had been looking out the window, at darkness, at nothing, or perhaps at something she could not perceive, and the shift of his attention to her face was complete and immediate, like a lamp being unshuttered. "There are none," he said. "There are always terms." Something crossed his face. Not offense, closer to recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has heard their own thoughts spoken aloud by someone they had not expected to think it. "You are correct," he said, after a pause that lasted long enough for the carriage to pass beneath an archway of bare winter trees. "The terms are these: shelter, safety, and no obligation of service. In exchange, I ask only that you reside at Asheville until certain matters are resolved." "What matters?" "That," he said, "will require explanation. I am not prepared to give tonight." It was not evasion exactly. It was more like the answer of someone who understood that information, given too early, before the recipient had sufficient context to hold it properly, was worse than no information at all. She recognized this too because it was also how she managed difficult things. "What is your name?" she asked. "Valerian," he said. "Valerian Ashvale. The house takes the family name, or the family took the house's name. After enough centuries, it becomes difficult to remember which came first." Centuries. She heard the word. She filed it precisely where it belonged, in the category of things she was not yet ready to respond to, and continued. "Isolde Vale," she said, "and the child is Clara." He looked at Clara then, and again there was that brief movement in his expression, quickly stilled. "I know," he said quietly. And then, before she could ask how, "Sleep, if you can. The road is long." She did not sleep. She watched him when she thought he was not observing her, which turned out to be never. She caught, twice, the faint shift of his gaze as she studied his profile, the angle of his jaw, the long hands resting motionless on his knees. Each time she simply held his gaze and did not look away, because looking away first was its own kind of capitulation. The third time their eyes met, something shifted between them. Not warmth, not yet anything as legible as warmth, but acknowledgement, the kind that passed between two very private people who had each recognized in the other a familiar architecture of self-containment. He looked away first. She noted this. She did not know yet what it meant. Ashvale rose from the moor like something that had grown there rather than been built. All towers and articulated stone. Windows that threw no reflection even when the carriage lamp swung close. Gates that opened to admit them with the same eerie soundlessness as the doors in Hollow Vein. The grounds were vast and dark, and she caught the scent of frost-killed roses. Hundreds of them, entire gardens gone to winter architecture. A woman met them at the door, perhaps 50, severe in gray wool, with eyes that moved to Isolde and Clara with an expression of complete unsurprise, as though she had been told to expect exactly this, and had found the expectation accurate. "Mrs. Holt will see to your needs," Valerian said. He had descended from the carriage first, not to hand Isolde down, she noted, but to speak briefly with Mrs. Holt with his back to the carriage, with a privacy that she respected automatically. When he turned back, there was something different in his bearing, some quality of restraint that had not been there in the carriage, or rather a different restraint, layered over the first, like a second coat of armor donned at the threshold. He was home, and home required different defenses than the road. "Rest," he said. "We will speak in the morning." He was already turning toward the interior of the house when Clara woke and made a small sound. Not crying, just the small, inquiring sound infants made at the edge of wakefulness, a sound that meant "I am here, is someone there?" And Valerian stopped. He stood with his back to them for 3 full seconds. Then he continued walking, and the darkness of Ashvale swallowed him. And Isolde stood on the threshold of a vampire lord's estate with her daughter in her arms and the copper ghost of a chain still aching on her wrist. She stepped inside. The doors closed softly behind her. She did not yet know what she had walked into, but she had walked in willingly, and for Isolde Vale, willingness had always been the beginning of everything. Morning came gray and reluctant through the high windows of the room Mrs. Holt had prepared. A room too fine for what Isolde was, with a canopied bed and heavy curtains, the color of dried wine, and a small adjoining dressing room that had been arranged impossibly, with items appropriate for an infant, a basket lined with wool, folded linen, a ceramic bottle of something that proved, upon cautious investigation, to be goat's milk kept warm by some method she could not identify. She stood at the window with Clara fed and drowsing against her shoulder and looked out at Ashvale's grounds in the pewter light. The rose gardens were vast. Even dead, they had a terrible beauty. Hundreds of canes arcing over iron frameworks, the remaining hips dark as old blood against the frost. Beyond them, a tree line of leafless oaks. And beyond that, nothing visible but moor and sky pressing together at a horizon that seemed unusually close. She had slept, despite herself, deeply, dreamlessly, which was unusual, because since Clara's birth she had slept in the shallow, vigilant way of someone who could not afford to be fully absent. Something about Ashvale's air made sleep unavoidable. She was not certain this comforted her. Mrs. Holt arrived with breakfast on the tray in the specific manner of a woman who answered questions with the minimum of information necessary and considered this a professional virtue. "Lord Ashvale will receive you in the library at noon," she said. "You are free to walk the east wing and the grounds. The west wing is private." She paused. "The west wing is always private. Does he receive guests often?" Isolde asked. "No." "Has he brought anyone here before?" Mrs. Holt looked at her with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been the ancestor of pity. The place where pity lived before it was certain of itself. "No, she said again, and left. Isolde ate everything on the tray. She had learned young that pride about food was a luxury, and she had lost most of her luxuries long before Halloween. The library ran the full length of the East Wing's second story. She found it by following the smell of old paper and leather, a smell she had loved since childhood, since her father's modest collection of agricultural texts and one volume of classical poetry that she had read until the binding gave. This was not modest. Floor to ceiling, every wall, tens of thousands of volumes in languages she recognized and languages she did not, organized by some principle she could not immediately discern. The room smelled of centuries. It smelled of time in the same way that Valerian himself had smelled, faintly, of something beyond the range of ordinary experience. Not unpleasant, only ancient, only vast. She was reading the spine of a volume in archaic Latin when she heard him. She had not heard him enter. This, she decided, was something she would need to adjust to. "You read Latin," he said from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She did not startle. She had been half expecting his presence for several minutes without knowing why. "Poorly," she said. "My father taught me enough to be dangerous and not enough to be useful." A pause. "Then, that is the most accurate description of a classical education I have encountered in several hundred years." She turned. He was perhaps 6 feet away, in daylight now, which she had not seen him in before, and which changed him in ways she was still cataloging. The darkness of the auction hall had softened things. Daylight showed the precise architecture of his face, the hollow temples, the way his skin held the quality of old marble, not gray, not pale exactly, but of a whiteness that had depth to it, as the light fell into it rather than off it. He was looking at the book she held, not at her. "You may take any volume from this room," he said. "The West Wing library is locked. You will not find a key." "Because I should not look," she said. "Or because the key does not exist?" "Both," he said. He finally looked at her. "You ask precise questions. I have found imprecise questions return useless answers." "Yes." Something in his posture shifted, not relaxing, exactly, but something settling, like a structure that had been braced for a force that had not arrived. "Sit, if you would. I owe you explanation." She sat in one of the leather chairs near the unlit fireplace. She noticed it was unlit, and that the room was cold in a way that did not seem to trouble him, and settled Clara in her lap and watched him. He remained standing. He stood at the window, in the gray light, and for a moment said nothing. Not gathering words, she thought, but deciding how much of the truth to give, and in what order. "Your daughter," he said finally, "carries a bloodline mark." Isolde said nothing. She waited. "It is not visible to human perception," he continued. "It is visible to mine. The mark indicates descent from a lineage that was believed extinct, a line that passed through your father's family, most likely, though the inheritance is not always direct." He paused. "Clara's mark is the reason you were at Hollow Vein tonight. The man who arranged your auction, Fenwick, is a collector. He does not know precisely what the mark means, but he recognized its value. He would have sold her to someone who did know." The cold of the room seemed to deepen. "What does the mark mean?" Isolde asked. Her voice was even. She was very proud of her voice in that moment. Valerian looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between reluctance and respect. "It means she is mine to protect," he said, "under laws that predate this country by 1,000 years. He paused, "and it means that whoever sent Fenwick to find her will not stop." Clara slept on, unbothered, one small fist curled against Isolde's chest. Isolde looked at Valerian Asheville in the gray library light and understood, with the quiet precision that had carried her through every hard thing in her life, that the worst was not behind her. It was only beginning. She found the broken glass on the third day. It was in the corridor outside the East Wing library, a narrow hall with a runner carpet the color of old moss, and a single tall window whose latch had failed in the night wind. The window had swung inward and knocked a small table, and the table had shed a vase, and the vase lay in perhaps 20 pieces on the stone floor, where the carpet runner ended. She found it at 2 in the morning because Clara had woken and would not be settled. and Isolde had been walking the corridor, bouncing gently, singing nothing in particular, just a low, rhythmic hum her own mother had used, passed down without words, pure vibration in the chest. When her bare foot found the largest shard, she did not make a sound. This was partly discipline and partly the specific maternal instinct that prevented mothers of infants from doing anything that might wake what had just been, through exhaustion and persistence, persuaded toward sleep. She stood absolutely still with the shard in her heel, and Clara finally slack and heavy in her arms and breathed through her nose with great care. Then she bent, slowly, compensating her weight, and set Clara on the corridor floor on the carpet runner, away from the glass, and straightened and examined the situation. The cut was not deep, inconvenient mostly. She began to step carefully around the larger pieces toward the end of the corridor, where she'd seen a linen cabinet, calculating the logistics of this without waking her daughter. When she became aware that she was not alone, she turned. Valerian stood at the far end of the corridor. He had no lamp. He needed no lamp. This was one of the things she had added to her private list of observed facts about Ashvale's lord. He navigated the house's darkness with a completeness that made it seem less like darkness and more like a different kind of visibility, available only to him. He was still in the clothes of the day before, or clothes identical to them. She had not yet determined whether he kept ours recognizable as human, and he was looking at her foot. She looked down. The blood was more than she'd estimated. The shard had found something worth finding. "It's minor," she said. He was beside her before she finished the sentence. She had not seen him cross the distance. He was simply elsewhere, and then he was there. Crouched before her, not touching, but close, examining the cut with an intensity that would have been alarming if his face had shown anything other than assessment. "The glass is still in it," he said. "I know." He looked up at her from his crouched position. The corridor's shadows fell differently from this angle, his face upturned, the darkness behind him, his eyes picking up the faint window light in a way that made them briefly, unsettlingly reflective. "May I?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the shape of a question with the uncertainty removed. Not a demand, but a statement of request offered for acceptance or refusal. She realized he would not touch her without the word. She realized this with a certainty that settled something in her chest. "Yes," she said. He removed the glass. His hands were careful with a precision that went beyond training, the precision of something very old that had had occasion to do many delicate things and had long since burned away anything but perfect control. She felt the extraction as a brief, clean pain and nothing more. He produced a cloth from somewhere. She did not see where, and pressed it to the cut. He held it there, maintaining pressure with a kind of focused patience that reminded her of the way he held his own stillness, not absence, but deliberate, applied calm. She looked down at the crown of his bowed head. His hair fell forward. She looked away. "The latch on the east window," she said, because she needed words to occupy the space. It failed. "I know. I heard it." A pause. "I heard you step on the glass." "From where?" "The West Wing." She absorbed this. The West Wing was far enough that a human occupant would not have heard her catch her breath, let alone locate the origin of a specific sound. "Your hearing," she said. "Yes." He did not elaborate. He lifted the cloth, assessed the cut, pressed it again. "This will need binding. Can you stand?" "I've been standing." "On it. Can you walk?" "I'll manage." He looked up at her again with the same expression she was beginning to recognize, that particular quality of recalibration, like a man repeatedly encountering information that modified his existing model of something. "You do that with most things," he said. "Manage." "It's useful." "It is." He rose, and the motion was fluid and immediate. No creak, no pause, simply the change from one position to another, as though physical laws consulted him before applying. He looked at Clara sleeping on the carpet runner, undisturbed through all of this. "She sleeps deeply. On good nights. And on bad ones you walk the corridors alone at 2 a.m. "I do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You might knock at the study door. On the bad nights." She looked at him. He was not looking at her when he said it, looking instead at the window, the failed latch, the moonless exterior dark. And something about this, the deliberate absence of his gaze while he made the offer, made it easier to hear. "I'll note that," she said. He picked up Clara. He did it without asking, without announcing, simply stooped and gathered the child with the same careful competence with which he had removed the glass, one hand supporting her head, and Clara did not wake, only exhaled and turned her face into the warmth of his shoulder. He held the child for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he looked at Isolde with an expression she had no name for, something that lived between tenderness and grief, and transferred Clara back to her arms. "The study is the 3rd door past the stair," he said. "On the bad nights." He walked back into the dark. Isolde stood in the corridor with her daughter and her bandaged foot, and the strange warmth of the grief she hadn't earned yet spreading through her chest like a stain. Mrs. Cale. Holt did not speak of the past unprompted. Isolde had established this on the 4th day, and had established it through careful observation rather than direct inquiry, watching how the housekeeper navigated certain rooms, which portraits she dusted without looking at, which doors she bypassed as though they were simply not there. The portrait gallery, however, she cleaned with something that bordered on ceremony. Isolde brought Clara and watched, one morning, from the doorway. The gallery ran along the south face of the manor, a long, narrow room with a single bench at its center and perhaps 30 portraits in frames of varying age and ornateness. Some were very old, oils on wood panel, cracked in the patterned way of things that had survived actual centuries. Others were more recent, in the sense that recent could mean within the last 100 years. Valerian appeared in none of them. She walked the length of the gallery when Mrs. Perrina, Holt, had gone, slowly reading the small brass plates at the base of each frame. Ashvale names some of them, going back 8 generations. But also other names, women's names, she realized, every 3rd portrait or so, not identified by family relation as wives or daughters might have been, but by single names only. Marguerite, Constance, Thea, Lavinia, women of different eras, different styles of dress, all painted, with the same attention to the eyes, always the eyes, in every portrait given the finest detail of the work, the clearest light, as though the painter had been specifically instructed to make certain the eyes survived the centuries. They are not his wives. She turned. Valerian stood in the gallery doorway, something she was becoming accustomed to, his arrivals without auditory warning. She waited. He entered the gallery with a visible reluctance, stopping a few feet inside as though the room had a threshold he preferred not to cross. He looked at the portraits the way one looked at things that had survived one by living on without one, a specific quality of resigned endurance. "Women under his protection," she said. "Understanding, not guessing." "Under Ashvale's protection," he said with a precision she noted. "Not his, the estate's." As though the house itself were an institution, separate from its lord. The bloodline mark has appeared in different families across different centuries. When it does, Ashvale has been involved. "And the women themselves," she said, "were they all? Did they all?" "They lived their lives," he said. "Most of them. They were kept safe, and when the threat resolved, they returned to the world." He paused. "Some chose not to." She looked back at the portraits. Marguerite, Constance. She looked at Constance's eyes, painted with extraordinary care, a warm brown, slightly too knowing for the period's fashion of doe-like feminine gaze. "And the children?" she asked. "If the mark is inherited, the mark does not always pass. But when it does, the child is also protected." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara's mark is stronger than any I have seen in 4 centuries. She looked at him. "What does the strength of the mark mean?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He looked at one of the older portraits, the wood panel ones, Marguerite or someone before her, and his expression had the quality of something being translated from a language that did not map cleanly onto the one available. "It means the lineage has been converging," he said finally. "Concentrating. Your family, Vale, or whatever name it carried before, has been moving toward something for a very long time. Clara is not an accident of bloodline. She is a culmination." "Of what?" "That," he said. "I am still determining." It was the second time he had deferred a full answer. And again she read it not as evasion, but as genuine uncertainty, which was more frightening than evasion would have been. An ancient creature admitting the limits of his knowledge was not reassuring. "The man," she said, "the one who sent Fenwick. Who is he?" Valerian looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a decision being made and then made differently. "His name is Caius," he said. "He is old. Older than Ashvale, older than this estate's purpose. He collects bloodline marks for reasons that have not changed in 600 years. And those reasons? He believes the converging lineage can be used," Valerian said, "to break a binding, a very old one." He finally moved, crossing the gallery slowly, not toward her, but to a specific portrait near the end of the row. A woman in early Victorian dress, her single name plate reading Lavinia. He stood before it for a moment. He has tried before. He failed. But the mark was never this strong. "He'll come here," Isolde said. It was not a question. "He is already looking." Clara made a small sound in Isolde's arms. Both of them looked at her, the child oblivious in her warmth and her infancy to the centuries of weight arranged around her. Isolde looked at Lavinia's portrait. The extraordinary eyes. "She chose not to return," Isolde said. "To the world. After." Valerian looked at Lavinia's portrait for a long moment without answering. Then, she said there was nothing out there she had not left behind willingly. He paused. "I told her that would not always be true." Was it? Always true? He turned and looked at Isolde with an expression that was very still and very old, and underneath the stillness, like a current under ice, entirely something else. "I don't know," he said quietly. "She died before I could ask." He left the gallery. Isolde stood among the portraits of women who had stood in this same house and looked at the same lord and made the same quiet calculations she was now making, and felt for the first time the depths of the thing she had walked into on that threshold night. It was not shallow. Valerian Ashvale stood in the West Wing library at 3 a.m. and did not move for 1 hour. This was not unusual. He had stood still for longer, in darker rooms, in centuries that had produced nothing worth recording. Stillness was his natural state. Stillness was what remained when you had lived long enough to know that motion was mostly noise. But tonight the stillness had a different quality. It was effortful. It was the stillness of something actively held. He was aware, through 4 stone walls and 2 locked doors and a distance of considerable corridor, of Isolde Vale. She was not asleep. This was the 4th night she had been awake past the 2nd hour. The child was restless, he thought, or the house was unsettling, or some combination of both that produced the particular quality of wakefulness he could detect in her, controlled, alert, processing. She walked some nights. Other nights, she sat and was still in the way that only people who had learned to be very private and very self-sufficient were still, not passively, but with a quality of active internal attention, as though she were consulting something inside herself. He had made the offer, knock at the study door. She had not knocked. He was not surprised. He was, in a way that he observed with some detachment, something adjacent to disappointed. And this, the capacity to be disappointed by a human woman's not knocking on his study door, was information he received about himself with considerable wariness. He crossed to the long table that ran the center of the West Wing library. Its surface was covered in materials that would not have been legible to a human scholar. Texts in 3 extinct languages, a rolled vellum of considerable age, a series of annotated maps showing migration patterns of bloodline families across 8 centuries. He had been building this record for longer than England had been governed by its current system. Clara's mark corresponded to a lineage that appeared in his records 9 generations back, and a woman named for a month, July, or its equivalent in the language of the time, who had encountered something in the mountains of a country that no longer existed and had, through some mechanism he had spent 4 centuries not quite decoding, absorbed a quality of the old binding into her own blood, which meant it had passed, down and down and down through ordinary human generations, through marriages and births and unremarkable lives, until it had arrived, concentrated and somehow refined by the accumulated descent, in a 4-month-old girl sleeping under his roof. He did not know what Caius intended to do with the mark. He had theories. They were all bad. He picked up the vellum, unrolled it, looked at a passage he had looked at perhaps 400 times and understood perhaps a third of, which was a third more than anyone else currently living. The concentrated line may be used to open or to seal. The child carries both potential. The choice belongs to the blood's guardian. Guardian. The word in the original language was closer to one who precedes the blood into danger. An older and more specific meaning than the English approximated. He thought about Isolde in the portrait gallery, looking at Lavinia's eyes. He thought about what she had not said, looking at those eyes, the question she had not asked, which was, what happened to the ones who left? She had asked instead about Lavinia, the one who stayed, with the instinct of a person who already knew the answer to the question she was not asking. He thought about Clara turning her face into his shoulder in the dark corridor. He thought about the sound Isolde's foot had made on the glass. The involuntary, immediately suppressed sound of someone who had trained themselves not to react to pain and had nearly succeeded, that the suppression was automatic, that she had caught it so quickly. He put the vellum down. He thought, she has spent her entire life learning not to need things. He thought, I have spent several centuries learning the same lesson. He thought, this is not reassuring information. From somewhere in the east wing, past the stone in the distance, a soft knock, a familiar small sound. Clara waking, and then Isolde's voice, barely audible even to him. Just the vibration of it, the hum she used, wordless, deliberate, the specific frequency of a mother telling a child, I am here. Valerian Ashfurley stood in the West Wing library at 4 a.m. and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something he did not have good defenses against. Not hunger. He had defenses against that. Long and well built, not grief. He had defenses against that too, older and more elaborate. This was something else, something that felt like watching a door he had kept locked for a very long time begin, slowly and without apparent external force, to open. He did not move toward it. He was old enough to know that some doors, once opened, did not close. He stood still and waited for his defenses to reassemble themselves, and they did. They always did. But they were slower tonight. They returned to their positions with something that might almost have been reluctance. He crossed to the window, looked out at Ashvale's grounds, the dead rose gardens, the dark sky beginning at the horizon, to lighten almost imperceptibly toward the idea of dawn. Caius was moving. He had felt it 3 days ago, a vibration in the old bindings, the particular frequency of something ancient and purposeful beginning to orient itself. He had perhaps 2 weeks, perhaps less, if Caius had resources he had not accounted for. He should be spending this hour on strategy, on preparation. He was spending it in a library listening to a woman hum her daughter back to sleep. He remained at the window until the last of the darkness was gone and the gray came, and told himself this was reconnaissance. That knowing the house's sounds was protective instinct, that listening had nothing to do with anything else. He was old enough to lie to himself very convincingly. He was not old enough to believe it. The box arrived on a Tuesday. It was small and unassuming, silver plate over wood, latched with a mechanism she did not recognize, left on the front steps of Ashvale in the hour between Mrs. Holt's morning round and Isolde's descent for breakfast. She found it herself, having come down early with Clara, and she did not touch it. She looked at it from the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds, and then went to find Valerian. She found him in the study because she had, on the 9th day, the previous night, knocked at the study door, and he had opened it with an expression of complete unsurprise and offered her a chair and a book without comment, and they had sat in the study's quiet for an hour while Clara slept in her basket by the fire, and outside the wind made sounds in the eaves, and nothing of significance had been said, and it had been the most not alone Isolde had felt in years. She knocked now, and told him about the box and watched his expression change. What replaced his usual controlled neutrality was not alarm but something more precise than alarm. The expression of someone processing a confirmation rather than a surprise. something he had expected, arriving on the schedule he had feared. He went downstairs without a word. She followed. He examined the box without touching it, circled it once, stood before it for a moment with his hands behind his back and his head tilted very slightly, and she had the impression of faculties being applied that she had no framework for understanding. "Don't open it," he said. "I wasn't going to." He looked at her briefly. "I know." He crouched before the box. "The latch is a binding mechanism. Old. If you had touched it." He stopped, started again. "It was designed to be opened by a specific bloodline. It would have activated." Activated what? A trace. He stood. If it found what it was looking for, it would have told Caius she was here, that the mark was here. He would have had a precise location. But I didn't touch it. No. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to map with some precision, the specific arrangement of his face when something she had done, through instinct or judgment, turned out to have mattered more than she knew. "No, you didn't. You had warned me about being careful," she said. "I was being careful." "You were," he said. "Yes." He dealt with the box through methods she did not entirely observe. She was in the doorway with Clara, maintaining distance as he had indicated, and what she saw was deliberate and brief and involved no visible tools and left the box inert, its silver surface no longer carrying the quality she now realized she had registered subconsciously on finding it, a faint hum, like a string tuned to a frequency just below hearing. When it was done, he came back to the doorway. "He knows the general area," he said. "The box was a test of specificity. It failed, but it tells us he's close enough to deliver it in person or near person." "How close?" "The village, or the road before it." She absorbed this. "What do we do?" He looked at her with something she recognized, now, as a specific kind of conflict, the conflict of a very private and self-sufficient person who had learned, over centuries, to plan alone, encountering a circumstance in which planning alone was demonstrably inferior to planning with someone who might actually help. "We prepare as fails defenses," he said finally. "There are old measures. The estate's original purpose included protection against exactly this kind of incursion." He paused. "And you stay inside, both of you." "I understand." She looked at him. "Tell me what I can do." He looked at her for a moment, that same recalibration she had catalogued across 2 weeks of mornings and evenings and late-night studies. "Then, there is a room on the east side, the old receiving room. It has not been used in 50 years. I need the floor clear, and the east window shuttered." "I can do that. It's dusty. I've seen dust before." A pause. The corners of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, brief and quickly reabsorbed, like a reflection in disturbed water settling. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you have." They worked through the afternoon in parallel, he in the west wing, she in the receiving room, Mrs. Holt brought in for purposes she received without question. Clara was installed in the receiving room in her basket, awake and uncomplaining in the way she sometimes was, alert and calm, watching the ceiling's plasterwork with the focused interest of someone who found everything new and therefore everything equally worthy of consideration. Isolde worked. She was good at work. She had always been good at work, not joyfully, not with any particular talent for domesticity, but with the same quality she brought to everything difficult: complete attention and a refusal to be demoralized by scope. When the room was clear and the shutters fastened, she sat on the floor for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, listening to the house. It had a sound, Asheville, a low, structural hum that she had heard since the first night and assigned to old buildings settling. She was less certain of that assignment now. It sounded, tonight, different, purposeful, like breathing. She opened her eyes to find Valerian in the doorway. He had been working. She could see it in small ways she would not have noticed 2 weeks ago. His hair slightly disarranged from its usual order, his coat removed, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked at the cleared room and then at her. "Good," he said simply. "Will it hold?" she asked. "Whatever you're building." He looked at her for a long moment, She had the sense again of something behind the stillness, the current, the thing that lived beneath the control. "I built this estate's defenses myself," he said, 1,200 years ago. He paused. "They held then." "Then," she said. "Then," he agreed, and did not pretend the qualification wasn't there. He looked at Clara. "When he comes," Isolde said, "what will he try to take? Her or both?" Valerian said. "Her for the mark. You for leverage." She had known this. Knowing it stated plainly was different. "I see," she said. She looked at her daughter's face in the basket, still tilted upward at the ceiling plasterwork, still entirely trusting of the world, the trust of something too young to have learned otherwise. "Then we won't give him either," she said. Valerian looked at her with that expression she had no name for yet, the one that lived between tenderness and grief. "No," he said quietly, "we won't." Caius came on a Thursday, in the hour before dawn. She knew he was there before any alarm sounded, before any door opened or candle snuffed. She knew in the way she had learned to know things at Ashvale, through the house's hum, which shifted in pitch and quality the way wind shifted before weather, which spoke in a register she had spent 2 weeks tuning her attention to until she could read it. The hum became a warning. She was already awake. She lifted Clara and wrapped her in the thick wool blanket Mrs. Holt had laid out the previous evening without explanation. Mrs. Holt had laid out the previous evening without explanation. Holt had known, she realized, had been given instruction, and went to the study door. Valerian opened it before she knocked. He was dressed, armed, though not visibly. She understood this about him now, that his arms were himself, the density of his presence, the capacity she had only glimpsed and never wanted directed at her. He looked at Clara wrapped in wool, and something in his posture adjusted. "The receiving room," he said. "Stay there. Don't open the shutters regardless of what you hear." "What will I hear?" "Old things," he said simply. He looked at her. Isolde. It was the first time he had used her name without the formality that had attended all their early exchanges. Just that, her name, in his low voice, in the study doorway at 4 a.m. "I know," she said, meaning, "I'll stay." Meaning, "I trust your preparations," meaning several other things she was not ready to say yet. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then he moved past her and she heard his footsteps on the stone. And then she did not hear them, because he stopped making sounds the way he sometimes did, the way that meant he had moved outside of whatever range human perception covered. She went to the receiving room. What followed was not like anything she had prepared for, despite having prepared as carefully as she could. The sounds were old, as he had said, not violent, exactly, or not violent in any way she had a vocabulary for. She heard the house respond, the structural hum rising and layering on itself, harmonics building that pressed on her inner ear and made the floor vibrate through the stone beneath her. She heard, once, a voice that was not Valerian's, lower and darker, and carrying a quality of age that Valerian's voice, old as it was, did not carry, a quality like something that had never considered that things existing in the world was the natural order. She sat against the east wall with Clara against her chest and one hand flat on the floor, feeling the house's activity through stone and mortar and 1,200 years of defended purpose. She did not open the shutters. She sang the hum her mother had taught her, low, vibrationless to the outside world, only felt in her own chest and felt in Clara's chest pressed against hers, and she did not know if it helped or was simply the only thing she could do. But she did it with the full attention of a woman who had learned that presence was its own form of protection. An hour, possibly more. Time in the receiving room had a quality she could not track. Then the hum changed. It resolved. The harmonics collapsed back into their base frequency and then below it, and the house exhaled. She felt it, the specific sensation of a held thing releasing, and then silence. She waited. Footsteps in the corridor. She knew his pattern now, or she knew this version of it, heavier than usual, with the particular quality of someone carrying more weight than they had started with. She opened the door. He was in the corridor. He had been in a fight. Visible, finally, in the ways his earlier stillness had masked. A tear in his coat. a quality of disarrangement that she had not seen in him before, as though the very controlled surface had been, briefly, disrupted. His left hand was pressed against his side. "Caius?" she asked. "Gone." He stopped, looked at her and Clara in the doorway. Something in him settled the way she had observed before, but larger this time, more profound, as though the sight of them standing in the doorway was information he had not let himself need until he confirmed it with his own eyes. "Are you wounded?" she asked. "It will resolve." She stepped into the corridor. She did not think about this. She simply moved toward the wound the way she moved toward anything that required attention, with automatic competence and no particular ceremony. He went still. "Let me see," she said. "It's not 'let me see,' Valerian." The second use of his name between them. He heard it the way she had heard hers. She saw it in the brief change in his expression. He moved the hand. The wound was significant. She did not say so. She applied pressure with the cloth she had carried from the receiving room. She had thought to take it, some instinct in the hour of waiting, and looked at his face rather than the wound, because faces told you more about severity than wounds often did. And his face was controlled and white and telling her several things. "She is safe?" he asked. "She's here. We're both here." He looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the uncomplicated directness of a baby encountering a familiar face and reached one hand toward him in the reflexive way infants reach toward things they recognized. He touched her fingers with one of his, very briefly. The gesture was so contained, so careful, that it was almost invisible. Almost. Isolde looked at him and felt the current under the ice the way she had felt it before, only closer now, and less distant, and no longer ignorable. "Come to the study," she said. "I'll see to this properly." He did not argue. She led the way, and he followed, and somewhere in the walk down the corridor in the early dawn, quiet of Ashvale, she understood that the distance between them, which had been considerable and deliberately maintained by both of them, had changed in the night, not closed, but changed, in the specific way that distances changed when someone had stood between you and the dark. She tended the wound in the study by the returning morning light, and he sat for it with a quality of surrender that she understood was significant. Valerian Ashvale, in the weeks she had known him, was not a man who surrendered to circumstance. He navigated it, he managed it, he arranged his position relative to it with care. Allowing her hands near the wound in the thin morning light was not nothing. She did not make it nothing by speaking. They were both quiet for the length of time it required. Clara sat in her basket by the cold fireplace and watched the ceiling and occasionally made sounds of personal observation. The wound, she had concluded, was deep but not structural. There was a quality to it, she noticed, that was different from a human wound, a quality of it already beginning to change at its edges in ways she chose not to examine too closely. When she finished, she sat back. "Will you tell me," she said, "what happened?" He told her. Not in detail, but in outline. Caius at the gate, the activation of the estate's old defenses, a negotiation that had not remained a negotiation, a binding attempt that Caius had tried at the property line and that Ashvale's original wards had resisted. Caius had not been defeated, he had been repelled, which was not the same thing. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes." Valerian looked at his bandaged side. "But not the same way. He knows now that the estate holds." He paused. "He'll try a different leverage." "What leverage does he have left?" Valerian looked at her. She understood. "He'll try to reach us outside the estate," she said. "If I need to leave for any reason, you cannot leave the estate." "I know that. I'm saying he knows it too, and he'll try to create a situation that forces it." The recalibration crossed his face again, but different now. Not the expression of someone encountering unexpected intelligence, but the expression of someone encountering something they had stopped allowing themselves to expect. "Yes," he said simply. "He will." The morning light had arrived in full by now, gray winter sun settling through the study windows, showing the room in its daylight face. Shelves and papers and the accumulated materials of a very long life, organized by a mind that had had centuries to impose its particular order on things. She sat in the chair she had started to think of as hers, the one on the left side of the fireplace, because he always took the right, and looked at the room. "You have been alone here a long time," she said. Not a question. Yes, Lavinia was the last. He was quiet for a moment. "Lavinia left 70 years ago," he said. "She lived another 40 after that. I knew when she died." He paused, and the pause had weight. The binding between guardian and protected. There is a sensitivity, an awareness. At the distance of her life, after she left, it was faint, but it was there. And when she died, it resolved, he said, with the neutrality of someone describing a very large thing in very small words, the way things resolve when they are completed. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the winter grounds. "And Clara's binding," she said carefully, "between guardian and protected. It is different," he said. He turned from the window. "It is not established yet. It requires acknowledgement from both sides." He looked at her with an expression she could finally name because she had seen it enough times now and had built enough context to understand what it was. It was the expression of a man carefully not saying what he was thinking because what he was thinking was not something he had permission to say. "From the child's guardian," she said. "Her mother." "Yes." She held his gaze. "If I acknowledge it," she said, "what does that mean for you?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dead rose garden. Inside, Clara made a sound of personal satisfaction at the ceiling. "It would mean," he said, "that I am bound to her safety, to yours, that the awareness I described, that sensitivity, extends in both directions." He paused. "That I would know, wherever you are, whether you were well." "And when the threat resolves," she said, "when Caius is dealt with and the mark is protected, what happens to the binding?" "That depends," he said, "on what you choose." She looked at him, the length and stillness of him in the study chair, the bandaged side, the gray light across his face. She thought about Lavinia, who had left. She thought about the portrait gallery of women who had stood in this same house and made this same calculation. And she thought about what it meant that Valerian, who was older than all of them, was still here, still holding the estate open, still maintaining its purpose. Not, she was beginning to understand, out of obligation. Out of something quieter and more private than obligation. "I should like," she said carefully, "to understand all of what I would be choosing, before I choose." "Yes," he said. "You should." "Then tell me," she said. "All of it. Take as long as it requires." He looked at her with that expression, the one between tenderness and grief, and she saw it, finally, more clearly than she had before. It was not grief at all. It was grief's cousin, the expression of someone who had stopped wanting something long enough ago that wanting it again felt dangerous. "I will," he said. He began to talk. She listened through the morning and into the afternoon, and she asked questions when she had them, and did not when she didn't. And Clara slept and woke and slept again, and outside the gray sky moved slowly east, and inside the study of Ashvale the distance changed again, not closing, not yet, but the space between them becoming something different from what it had been, something chosen, on both sides. The snow came a week later, which Isolde had not expected. Ashvale's climate seemed to operate by different conventions than the surrounding moorland. Colder, grayer, more committed to its moods. She stood at the east window and watched the dead rose garden fill with white, and thought about choices. Valerian had told her everything, over 3 days of careful conversation, not in one sitting, not in a torrent, but with the same deliberateness he brought to all things, parceling information in quantities she could absorb and process before the next arrived. The bloodline's history, Caius's nature and purpose, the binding's mechanics and the freedom it would and would not allow, the lives of the women in the portrait gallery in more detail than the brass plates provided, who they had been, where they had come from, what they had chosen and why, what he had not told her, what he wanted. She understood that this was intentional. She understood that he was, with exquisite care, constructing a situation in which she could choose freely, in which the information was complete and the pressure was absent, and whatever she decided would be unambiguously hers. She respected this. She also found it, at this point, somewhat frustrating. She found him in the library. He was at the far window. He spent considerable time at windows, she had noticed, as though the act of looking outward was its own form of thought. He turned when she entered, which she took as evidence that he had known she was coming, which she also took as evidence in a different register, the binding sensitivity, even unacknowledged, already present. The snow, she said. Unusual for the season, he agreed. She came to stand beside him at the window. Not at conversational distance, closer. The distance she had been maintaining for 3 weeks and had decided this morning to stop maintaining. He went very still. "You have been careful," she said, looking at the snow filling the rose garden, "not to tell me what you want." Silence. "I noticed this," she said, "and I understand why. And I'm telling you now that I am capable of weighing your preference alongside everything else without being determined by it." She paused. "So I'm asking." A long silence. Outside, the snow fell with the particular patience of things that had been accumulating for a very long time. "I want," he said finally, and his voice was different. Lower. Stripped of the layer of control she had come to know it by. "What is not reasonable to want? Tell me anyway." He looked at the snow. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not for the binding, not for Clara's protection, which I will provide regardless. I want you to stay because—" He stopped. Started again, with the specific difficulty of a very private and very articulate man encountering the limit of articulation. "Because the study is different when you are in it. Because the house has been quiet for 70 years and is not quiet now. Because I have been a guardian of bloodline marks for 12 centuries and I have not." Another stop. "I have not wanted one of them to stay before." She looked at him. He looked at the snow. "Lavinia," she said. "Lavinia I cared for," he said carefully. "As I care for all of them. What I feel—" He turned and looked at her, finally, directly, with nothing of the controlled surface left, just the thing beneath it, which was old and vast and had clearly been locked for a very long time and was deeply uncertain about being unlocked. "What I feel is not the same category of thing." She held his gaze. She thought about 22 years of managing alone. She thought about the threshold of Ashvale, the step inside, the willingness that had always been her beginning. She thought about a man who had stood between her daughter and an ancient darkness and come back across the threshold wounded and asked first about the child. She lifted her hand. She placed it against his chest, over the heart. Not over the bandaged wound, but above it. The slow-beating reality of him under her palm. He looked down at her hand. Then at her face. "I am not Lavinia," she said. "No," he said quietly, "you are not." "And I am not one of the others." She held his gaze. "I am Isolde Vale. And I have made my own choices since I was 14 years old, and I am capable of making this one." She felt his hand come to rest over hers. Not pressing, not grasping, simply resting there, a question held in the lightest possible grip. "The binding," she said. "I'll acknowledge it. Isolde, for Clara," she said. "And for other reasons I think you understand." He looked at her for a long moment. His hand remained over hers. "If you do this," he said, "and later you wish to leave, then we will navigate that," she said, "when it occurs. I make decisions as they are required, not in advance of things that haven't happened yet." She looked up at him. "That is, I believe, the same position you occupy." Something moved across his face. The shadow and the settling. The thing she had been watching across 3 weeks of mornings in libraries and the receiving room floor and a corridor with broken glass. It settled into something she had not seen before on his face and did not have a word for yet, but which she thought she might have time to name. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "It is." Outside, the snow continued to fall on the rose garden of Ashvale, on the dead canes and the frost-held hips and the iron frameworks that had supported 100 years of summers. Under the snow, invisible, the root structures of old roses, still alive, still holding their purpose in the frozen ground, waiting for the season to shift. In the library, Isolde Vale stood with her hand over an ancient heart and chose. Clara, in the basket by the window, reached both hands toward the snowlight, perfectly trusting, as though she had known all along how this would go. Spring came late to Asheville, but it came. Isolde noted this with the specific satisfaction of someone who had spent a winter being prepared to be disappointed and had not been. The rose canes put out new growth in March, pale and stubborn and absolutely committed, which she found she respected, and by April, the garden had begun to reassemble itself from its winter architecture into something that would, given sufficient time, become the thing she had seen in its dried hips and preserved bones extraordinary. Caius came twice more. The first time, in February, he sent agents rather than himself. 3 of them, human by origin, working on his behalf with something that Valerian had described as compelled service, in the tone he used for things that were very old and very wrong. They did not reach the estate. Asheville's defenses held, and Valerian dealt with what had breached the outer perimeter with an efficiency she had learned not to ask for the details of. The second time, in early March, Caius came himself. She had been in the library. She had heard the hum change. She had not gone to the receiving room. She had made a different decision. With Clara in her arms, she had gone to the east window of the library and looked out at the grounds and watched Asheville's defenses engage with the particular quality of someone who had decided that knowing was better than not knowing. Regardless of how difficult the knowing was, she had seen very little. The night was dark, and the confrontation was not visible in any ordinary sense. Only felt, through the house's hum, through the vibration in the floor. She had felt the moment it shifted, the moment the balance changed. She had felt Valerian through the binding she had acknowledged in January, through the sensitivity it extended in both directions. She had felt him, which was not a feeling she could have described to anyone who had not experienced it, and she had understood from the quality of it that he was winning and was not unharmed. She had waited. He had come back across the threshold, and this time she had met him in the front hall, and this time, when she put her hand against his chest, she was not asking a question. Caius had not returned after March. Valerian told her, on a Monday morning in the library with spring light arriving cautiously through the high windows, that Caius had been bound by a covenant of the old law, not destroyed, which was apparently a significant and rarely achieved thing, but bound and constrained and removed from any range of action that could threaten Clara's mark or Asheville's household. He used the word household and looked at her while he said it. "Is that what we are?" she said. "I believe so," he said. "If that is an acceptable description." "It is," she said, "though I'd say the description is incomplete." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The full look, the one she had been giving him since the portrait gallery, which had never been returned quite completely until recently, which was now returned completely every time. "Yes," he said, "it is incomplete." Clara learned to sit up in April, which produced in Asheville's lord an expression that Isolde had not previously witnessed on any human or otherwise face, and which she observed with considerable fondness, the expression of a person encountering something they had no defenses against because they had not known to build them in advance and had decided not to build them now. He sat on the library floor with Clara for 40 minutes on a Tuesday while Isolde read, because Clara had determined that the floor of the library was where she wished to be, and that Valerian was where she wished to be near, and the Lord of Asheville, 12 centuries old, had sat cross-legged on the library floor without comment, while an infant practiced the new skill of remaining vertical. Isolde did not say anything about this. She read her book. She allowed herself, in the interior space where she kept things, to feel the warmth of it entirely. The portrait gallery received a new lamp in May. She noticed it when she brought Clara through on a morning walk. A small lamp, oil, placed at the end of the gallery row, near the most recent portraits. Near Lavinia. She stood before Lavinia's portrait with Clara on her hip and looked at those extraordinary painted eyes. She thought about choices and the direction they moved in, whether you were kneeling or rising, whether the figure in the tapestry was descending or ascending, and how from a sufficient distance it was impossible to tell, and how perhaps that was not the relevant question. The relevant question was whether you were in motion, whether you had decided. She turned and found Valerian in the gallery doorway. She was no longer startled by his arrivals. She had not been, she thought, since January. "You added the lamp," she said. "The gallery was dark," he said. As though this explained everything. As though the lamp were simply an amenity and not the particular act of a man who was, very quietly, beginning to accept that the house had changed in nature. That household was the word for it, and the word was not incomplete anymore. She looked at him in the gallery doorway, tall and controlled and carrying all of his centuries like something he had stopped trying to put down. "Valerian," she said. "Yes." "Come in," she said. "It's your gallery." He came in. He stood beside her before Lavinia's portrait, and she stood beside him, and Clara reached toward the lamplight with the open-handed trust of something that had never learned to expect the light would not be given. Outside Ashvale's windows, the roses were beginning. Inside, 3 figures stood in a gallery of old choices and made, between them, without ceremony, the choice that turned out to be different from all the others. Not in its difficulty or its weight, but in this, it was made freely, by both of them, and neither, after, had cause to wish it unmade. The lamp burned on, the roses kept growing,